Welcome everyone to this month's webinar, The 6 W's of Clinical Trials and the Canadian Pipeline. My name is Natalie Simonian and I'm a research coordinator at Parkinson Canada. I'm sure everyone is eager to get started, but there are a few housekeeping items to go over first. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. From coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territories of Inuit, Métis, and First Nations peoples. We are grateful for our expert speakers joining us to share their knowledge during the course of this webinar. If you have any questions about today's topic after the conclusion of this webinar, please contact Parkinson Canada's information and referral team. To access closed captioning, click on the CC Captions button and then click on Show Subtitle. If you'd like to submit a question for our presenters, be sure to write it in the Q&A window. The chat window is there for you to say hello and talk amongst yourselves. I'd like to begin by providing a brief overview of the Parkinson Canada research program. So in Parkinson Canada's funding history, Parkinson Canada has been funding research for nearly 50 years. We've been funding research via the grant competition, which is open to any Canadian investigator doing Parkinson's research. We've been, within this grant competition, there's an annual research investment of $2 million each year for trainee awards, clinical movement disorder fellowships, pilot grants, new investigator awards, and more. Some areas of focus that we fund include causes of Parkinson's, diagnostic tools, quality of life, new therapies, and healthcare access. Parkinson Canada has also increased collaboration overall in our company via the Canadian Open Parkinson Network, which is a national network aimed to increase collaboration. Also via the eCare PD digital health app, which was created by Tiago Mestre and his group in Ottawa and was funded by Parkinson Canada. And the goal of that is for people living with Parkinson's to integrate care and to access more self-care support. In addition, we've continued to include people with lived experience in our research funding process, and we've been involved in funding partnerships, including supporting Dr. Kalia's rifabutin repurposing project with Cure Parkinson's in the UK. Parkinson Canada recently published a blog post providing an overview of the treatments that are currently in the Canadian clinical trials pipeline. And you can access this blog post by using the link I've displayed. And within this blog post, the total number of clinical trials in the Canadian pipeline is 139. During this webinar, we will learn more about these and other treatments and the different phases of clinical trials. And now we are going to share a video message from our President and CEO, Dr. Karen Lee.
Over 100,000 Canadians live with Parkinson's. We have one of the highest rates in the world. My name is Karen Lee. I'm the CEO of Parkinson Canada. My late grandfather lived with Parkinson's disease, and I know very well the importance of family and how they have to come together to support one another, but most importantly, the person living with Parkinson's. That is why I am dedicated and committed to ensuring Parkinson Canada continues to empower those living with Parkinson's. Each year, our programs and services reach over 10,000 people. We are a community. We are here not only for the person living with Parkinson's, but their family, friends, and their care network to ensure we all continue to thrive. Our advocacy efforts are focused on raising the voices of people affected by Parkinson's. Our Parkinson Advisory Council is made up of people affected by Parkinson's from across the country. They bring a diverse background and experience, but most importantly, they provide me and the organization with advice on topics that are important to them and their community. As a scientist, I know the importance of investing in bold and novel ideas that lead to breakthrough discoveries. At the same time, bringing researchers, clinicians, and people living with Parkinson's to collaborate to push the needle in our understanding of Parkinson's disease. We invest in the next generation of researchers and clinicians to ensure that we continuously understand the Parkinson's disease and also the care management of people affected by Parkinson's. When I'm in the community, I want people to know that Parkinson Canada is with them in every step of their journey with Parkinson's disease. People often ask, when is the right time to connect with Parkinson Canada? Is it when they have their first diagnosis? Is it when their symptoms get worse? Or is it when they need more information and resources? The answer is now. Researchers and clinicians are working tirelessly to find a cure. Meanwhile, every single day, 25 more Canadians are diagnosed with Parkinson's. Our goal is to empower people affected by Parkinson's to live well now.
Now let's get started. I'd like to introduce our first keynote speaker. Dr. Camila Aquino is an assistant professor and movement disorder neurologist at the University of Calgary. She's responsible for overseeing the deep brain stimulation program at the University of Calgary and is a clinical epidemiologist and trialist. She is also a member of the International Parkinson and Movement Disorder Society, where she actively participates in several committees, including the Evidence-Based Medicine Committee. Additionally, Dr. Aquino serves on the Parkinson Canada Trainee Committee, which is integral to the review process of the research grant competition. Her primary areas of focus include Parkinson's disease, deep brain stimulation for movement disorder treatment, clinical trials, and evidence-based medicine. Welcome, Dr. Aquino.
Thank you for the kind introduction and for the invitation. Welcome, everybody. I will share my screen now. So today we are going to talk a little bit about clinical trials and some important characteristics of this research methods. So let's start with the definition of what a clinical trial is. So it's an investigative type of research that's performed to test and evaluate the efficacy and safety of medical treatments, procedures, or interventions before we can actually recommend it to be broadly implemented in clinical practice. So sometimes when we are talking to patients and to families, there is a question why clinical trials are considered so valuable in the assessment of interventions. So in the picture that you can see on your screen, we have a classification of quality of information among different types of research methodologies. And as you can see from bottom up, we start with information that's derived from expert opinion. We go up to a small case series, or case reports when one or other patients tried some types of interventions. Then we, in the middle, we have case control studies and cohort studies. So these are studies that are mostly retrospective in nature. When we look to a certain population that was exposed to a type of treatment or that developed a disease, and we look what were they exposed before and how did that contribute or not to getting to a certain disease or problem. And then then it comes the clinical trials. So the randomized clinical trials. So those are in nature prospective studies in which we provide interventions to a group, and we have a control group where we will compare the endpoints of this for the disease that we are looking at. And then after many clinical trials have been done, we group them together in systematic reviews or meta-analysis, and that will build the body of evidence for us to know if a treatment should be applied in clinical care. So there are some very fundamental elements of clinical trials that make this type of research the gold standard for evaluating new treatments. So one of these aspects is what we call randomization. So the randomization is a process by which participants are allocated to either getting the intervention of the study or to getting the control. And that's a process that, as the name already says, it should be a random process. I shouldn't be separating groups according to specific characteristics. For instance, let's decide that we put males in one group or females in another group, or older patients in a group and younger patients. This would create a bias in the study because people may respond differently. So the randomization is the allocation by chance, and that will allow us to control the groups of the studies by the facts that we know and the facts that we don't know that they have. For instance, other disease that they have, other medications that they take, age, gender, and all that. So then we have the intervention, which is the main element of the study that we are testing. We have the control, which can be another treatment that is available or can be a placebo. We calculate the sample of the study, so how many subjects we need to evaluate to find a difference between the intervention and the control group. We decide the outcomes that are going to be assessed. So is this intervention something we are testing for the motor symptoms, for tremor, for dyskinesia, for a non-motor symptom, for anxiety, depression? We have the blinding component, which is the fact that either patients or investigators should not know which group the patients, the subjects were allocated for. So we can do a non-biased assessment of the outcomes that we are looking at. And there are studies that are double-blind and there are studies that are single-blind. So the double-blind ones is nobody knows which group the subject is allocated to. And the single-blinded, sometimes the patients will know which groups, but the investigators will not. We look at the safety measures, so safety of the intervention, safety of the placebo, or the control intervention, safety of the tests that are used during the study process. There is the statistical analysis where we identify the difference, if there was a statistical difference between the groups, and the follow-up, which depending on the outcome that you are looking at can be short, because it's something we can detect a difference early on, or it can be long if we are looking into things that develop over time. So there are different phases of clinical trials. So when we are talking about clinical trial process for drug development, it usually starts with preclinical studies. So studies in animal models or in cell cultures in the lab that will allow for the development, the initial development of potential intervention. Then the compound will move to a phase 1 trial, in which a few group of people, of subjects, a small group, test that compound for safety information. And then if it moves on, then there will be a phase 2 study with a larger sample where, again, safety will be evaluated, as well as the investigators will define which dose might lead to a better efficacy. So sometimes in these phase 2 trials, there will be groups taking different doses of the study intervention. And then the phase 3 is what we call like a larger clinical trial that will look more into efficacy and confirm the safety of the component. So this can be potentially approved and implemented in clinical practice. But there are times when we are testing interventions that are already available in clinical practice for treatment of other disease, and we want to just test if that medication would also be helpful in patients with Parkinson's. I'll give an example. There are some anti-cancer therapies like nilotinib, for instance, that was already available for treatment of cancer, and a group of investigators identified a potential benefit for that drug to be tested in patients with Parkinson's disease. So they conducted a study starting on the phase 2 and then went to so it started here, skipping the process of the phase 1 and preclinical studies that can happen, and then move on a bit quickly without all the very long timeline that it takes with drug development studies. Unfortunately, not always these studies provide the efficacy to the disease we are looking at. So when in Parkinson's disease, the most common types of interventions that are investigated in clinical trials include symptomatic therapies, which are interventions that look into treating the symptoms of Parkinson's, disease-modifying therapies, which are interventions that aim to slow down or to stop the progression of the disease, and device therapies as well, such as deep brain stimulation, MRI-guided focus ultrasound, other neuromodulation techniques. In addition, we are increasingly have a higher number of clinical trials looking into therapies provided by allied healthcare providers, for instance, physical therapy, speech therapy, occupational therapy, music therapy, and other types of interventions. So when a drug or an intervention complete all the phases of the clinical trials and it's deemed efficacious and safe for a population with Parkinson's, then it goes through several steps before it is available for us. So the most important of that step, of those steps, include regulatory approval and then the commercialization of the intervention. There are some barriers to accessing those interventions, especially right away after a trial, and those sometimes include the cost and the coverage by healthcare and insurances, access to the specialized care that is able to provide the prescription or that has the specialized team to prescribe there. This is particularly true for people living in rural and remote areas. There are wait times as well to reach, to get access to those healthcare providers. And in addition, there is a time also that is involves the healthcare provider education. So not all of us are familiarized with what has just been approved. And there is a learning curve until we learn how to prescribe and until we are familiarized with the potential benefits and side effects and with the population that will benefit from that. And also the referral patterns as well. So some treatments are only available in specialized centers. So patients need to be referred to those areas to get access. So if you are interested in looking for a clinical trial that is available and that's being currently recruiting, Most commonly, we use a website called clinicaltrials.gov. And on that website, you can choose the condition or disease you are looking for. You can select the country, you can mark the city, or give like a distance that you would be willing to travel. And you can mark that you're looking for studies that are currently recruiting participants. But if you're looking into all the studies that are being done, just for your knowledge, you can check that as well. And this will give you a screen like this. So I just did that search yesterday to look at what is currently recruiting in Canada for Parkinson's disease. And as you can see here, there are trials, as I didn't specify the city, you can see in Ontario, in Quebec, in British Columbia, in Alberta, what are the studies that are going on. So there are trials for physiotherapy, for exercise and sleep, cognitive testing, neuromodulation, apomorphine for pain, telerehabilitation, so music and targeting apathy. So those are some of the trials that are just right now recruiting or about to recruit. And if a potential candidate is interested, they can click on those studies and they will have the contact information for the study site and the investigators or the study coordinators. So there are also specific websites for each province. For instance, this is the website for Alberta, where you can see some of the trials that we are doing here at the University of Calgary. On the right side, it's a website specific for Ontario. It's called Trial Finder, ctontario.ca. The one in Alberta, it's called Be the Cure. There are also specific websites. If you just Google, find a clinical trial in and put the name of your province, you will find a specific website for all the provinces as well. So one question that patients often ask us is whether they should get involved in a clinical trial. And this is a very personal decision, and obviously we encourage people to take part. And there are different reasons why one should consider or not, and this needs to be aligned with their values and priorities. So the most important reason to get involved with a clinical trial is to be contributing to medical research. So it's not as much about ourselves as patients, but also about making that big contribution in the long term for research development. Some people state personal satisfaction as one of the reasons to be part of a study. Other people enjoy the fact that when they are in a clinical trial, they feel they get a closer medical monitoring and they have access to a more specialized care or are in an expert center. And some people feel empowered and more educated because they can learn more about their disease and the clinical trial process when they take part on a study. One thing that I always like to emphasize is that you will not know if you are for getting an actual intervention, if you are in a double-blind study or a placebo. So the fact that you believe you will be taking a medication that will benefit you should not be a very high priority because you don't know if that's going to be the case. So we have to be very realistic and not use that as a main reason to take part in a clinical trial. So there are also the risks that need to be considered, both the risks related to the intervention and also to the procedures. that are performed, and not only the risk, but also the discomfort. For instance, many of the ongoing clinical trials for Parkinson's have a lumbar puncture as part of the study. So is that something that you feel you can tolerate and take part? For most people, it's okay, and it's a very low risk. But those are things to keep in mind. And some people also feel that having the like financial support to come to the visits and like parking and like a little bit of a reimbursement is another fact that encourage them to take part in the study, so they don't feel they will be at any financial loss for committing their time and have this as a personal expense. So there are many different reasons, but as I mentioned, the contribution to medical research and to medical advances is usually what we see as the main priority for most people. So with that, I will stop here and we will continue with Dr. Kalia. Thank you so much for your time and attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aquino, for providing such a high-level overview of clinical trials. Any of the links that Dr. Aquino shared, I will be providing some of them in the follow-up email. I'd like to now introduce you to Dr. Lorraine Kalia. Dr. Kalia is an associate professor at the University of Toronto, clinician scientist at Toronto Western Hospital, a Parkinson Canada funded researcher, and chair of the Parkinson Canada Trainee Committee. Her research program aims to understand the key molecular mechanisms responsible for neurodegeneration in Parkinson's disease and to identify therapeutic agents that can modulate these molecular targets. She holds the Wolfgang Crumble Chair in Parkinson's Disease Research. She is co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Parkinson's Disease, vice chair of the Movement Disorder Society Scientific Issues Committee and Basic Science Interest Group, and treasurer of the Canadian Movement Disorder Society. Welcome, Dr. Kalia.
Hi. Thanks, Natalie, and thanks, Camilla. It's nice to be here with you in the afternoon for me, and greetings to everybody from Toronto. I'm just going to share my screen now. And I'm going to carry on from what you were just hearing with Dr. Aquino, and you'll hear a little bit of some repeated themes, which I think is always important in these talks to reiterate some of the important points that we hope you can get from these webinars. So we're continuing along with the theme of clinical trials. And I think there were some 6 W's that we were to answer, and these were the 4 W's that I had been assigned. So I'm going to go through these questions with you, and hopefully this will bring up some additional questions that we can then address in the question and answer period. So I'll take them each in turn. The first one may be simple for some of you, but maybe a concept that may be a little bit new to you, and I think is to some others of you. And I think it's important for us to kind of talk through them, especially when we're talking about therapies in general and also about experimental therapies. And the first one is, what is the difference between symptomatic therapies versus disease-modifying therapies? And you've heard this term already described. I'm going to go through it in a little bit more detail. But to begin, I'm going to just talk through symptoms in Parkinson's disease. And I present here a somewhat simplistic depiction of a very complex disease, which is Parkinson's disease, but trying to encompass many layers of the disease that are present over time. And so I'll just orient you to the way that this figure was put together. And so along the x-axis down here is time, with time 0 being around the time that someone's diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. And the y-axis here indicates the degree of impact that different things have on quality of life and disability. And each of these triangles represents different layers of aspects of the disease that compound over time to have impact on quality of life. And the majority of these are symptoms, so things that you experience due to Parkinson's disease. And you can see them written in here: constipation, REM sleep behavior disorder, depression, fatigue, and then the typical motor features: slowness of movement, tremor for some. Over time, these build on each other to cause more disability and impact quality of life further. And they tend to be divided into motor symptoms, being the kind of typical cardinal features that we look for when we're diagnosing Parkinson's disease, but also non-motor symptoms, which we know can be really substantial for people who have Parkinson's disease. And for some people, it's the more prominent issue for them. So what we have currently are medications that try to treat these symptoms. And some of the analogies that you'll often hear your doctor use when they're talking about these kinds of symptoms is they're similar to Band-Aids in that they are kind of trying to cover up stop gaps. They're similar to throat lozenges in that they're trying to relieve symptoms, for example, due to a bacterial infection that you have in your throat or a viral infection that you have in your throat, but actually don't affect the virus or the bacteria. And that's different from disease-modifying therapies. And to understand disease-modifying therapies, I just want to introduce this idea of neurodegeneration that is a hallmark of Parkinson's disease. And Parkinson's disease itself is what we call one of the most common neurodegenerative diseases. And what this big word basically means is that brain cells are dying faster than normal. All of our brain cells are dying as adults, but in Parkinson's disease, brain cells die at a faster rate, and certain ones die in particular. And the ones that are particularly affected in Parkinson's disease, but by far not the only brain cells that are affected, are ones that make a brain chemical called dopamine. And so what I have in the pink triangle down here is just a representation that this neurodegenerative process starts early in the disease, is the defining feature of the disease, and also progresses over the disease, and is what underlies all of the symptoms that we have. So what a disease-modifying therapy would do is it would actually have an effect on this neurodegeneration. It would stop neurodegeneration from happening, it would prevent neurodegeneration from happening, or in the best case scenario, it would actually reverse neurodegeneration. So what are common symptomatic and disease-modifying therapies that are available? Well, the common symptomatic therapies you are all probably expert in. And as you just saw from Dr. Aquino, there's different ways that we can kind of put them into different buckets. The most common therapies that we use and that everyone with Parkinson's disease are probably going to be taking at some point in their condition are pharmacological therapies. And the first four up here, and partly this fifth one here, are all based on this notion that dopamine is low in the brain of people with Parkinson's disease. And so all of these drugs were developed in some way either to boost your own dopamine, to give you extra dopamine, or to make the extra dopamine that you're given in a pill to last longer. There are some additional therapies that we call non-dopaminergic drugs, and they try and address different brain chemicals or different systems in the nervous system that are affected by Parkinson's disease. And these are really the mainstay of symptomatic therapies. There are advanced therapies, and primarily these advanced therapies that I've put in this lump here are related to more sophisticated ways of delivering dopamine. So still the main treatment that's being used is replacement of dopamine. And so some of you may have heard of the levodopa-carbidopa intestinal gel that's given by a J tube and a pump. There's a lot of interest, and we all await healthcare approval for this new modality of the delivery of a form of levodopa and carbidopa that would be given by a needle injected just beneath the skin attached to a pump. And it very much in the experimental realm, but I know many people have questions around it, is stem cell transplantation, which at least in my view is a very sophisticated way of delivering dopamine, because it's basically taking cells that will make dopamine and surgically implanting them into places in the brain where there is a paucity of dopamine. There are, of course, the neurosurgical therapies that, again, you heard about regarding symptomatic therapies. So deep brain stimulation, again, although a different kind of modality, is still just really addressing symptoms. And then different kinds of ways of making a neuroablation in the brain. So one being focused ultrasound is another way that we can help symptoms in Parkinson's disease. And of course, there's a whole host, this is a short list, not exhaustive at all, of non-pharmacological, non-surgical therapies that we think can also be beneficial from a symptomatic point of view. And I'm sure many of you experience on your own, for example, how exercise can make your symptoms in Parkinson's disease feel better. From the point of view of available disease-modifying therapies, I intentionally have this blank slide because this is what we have. We have no medications that can actually slow the progression of neurodegeneration and Parkinson's disease. We definitely don't have any medications that can stop or reverse it. This is where we're at in terms of what can be prescribed to you right now. That is not to say that there's not a ton of research being done to try and find disease-modifying therapies, or that there hasn't been in the past a ton of research to try and find disease-modifying therapies. We're just not yet there in terms of having things that we can prescribe today and now, which is why it's important for us to have clinical trials that test these types of medications. And as Dr. Aquino mentioned, for the right type of person who wants to be involved in a clinical trial, to participate in these trials so that we can discover these disease-modifying therapies. Sometimes people will tell me, well, brain diseases are so much more complicated than all of the other diseases. That's why we're doomed and we're never going to be able to find disease-modifying therapies. And I often include in this slide, and this is just always a reminder to me, this is a full slide of a whole bunch of different disease-modifying therapies for a different brain disease, multiple sclerosis. And I use this really mostly as an inspiration, but also as an indicator that a brain disease is treatable and that we can find disease-modifying therapies for Parkinson's disease. And the hope is that in years to come, we will have a similar kind of slide to show of all the different kind of disease-modifying therapies we have for Parkinson's disease. This next question is, what is drug repurposing? And again, Dr. Aquino gave you an example and mentioned that, and I'm just going to emphasize here from the disease-modifying therapy point of view, drug repurposing is being used by a lot of us, myself included, in my own research lab, to try and find drugs that can be disease-modifying therapies. And I'm just going to delve into, again, what we really mean by when we say, drug repurposing. Sometimes people call it drug repositioning. And really, it's taking drugs that are already approved for humans. So they've been shown to be safe in humans because they're being used for treatment of other diseases. And one example in the Parkinson's realm that some of you may be familiar with because you're probably on the drug is amantadine. Many people don't know this drug right now is probably only prescribed for Parkinson's disease and actually probably a little bit in multiple sclerosis for fatigue. But it was actually initially developed for influenza. So it was an anti-flu drug. It was used if somebody got the flu or actually to prevent somebody from having the flu in the 1960s. And as the story goes, somebody who had Parkinson's disease was given this drug for the flu and came back to their doctor and said, you know what, I think my Parkinson's symptoms are better when I'm on this medication. The astute doctor listened, and this led to examining this drug in a couple of other patients in case studies like Dr. Aquino mentioned, and then to actually go on to clinical trial to see if in fact the observation that that first patient had, that the drug was helping their Parkinson's symptoms, if that was actually the case. And it did turn out to be the case in clinical trials. And so in the 1970s, this medication was the medication used for treating Parkinson's disease motor symptoms. And then quickly levodopa became available and basically took over most of the treatments and as well as the newer medications that came after. Interestingly, I like to also mention that this drug even got repurposed within Parkinson's disease because in the 1970s, this drug was being used to treat tremor, to treat slowness of movement, to treat the main motor symptoms of Parkinson's disease. But as was also observed in the clinic, was that when people developed dyskinesia due to levodopa, that amantadine seemed to be helpful for that. And again, clinical trials proved, as well as clinical practice, that actually amantadine is really good for levodopa-induced dyskinesia. And I have to say this is the majority of its use right now. So repurposing can be applied to symptomatic therapies, but there's one reason why we're really trying to use it for disease-modifying therapies, and that is time. This is a similar diagram to what you saw from Dr. Aquino in terms of the different phases of clinical trials, where they start from laboratory studies and then go through each of the phases. And what I think you can't appreciate in this picture is just how much time has to elapse to get from laboratory studies to a drug that we're actually prescribing in the clinic. And so this could be as long as 13 to 15 years. It's an incredibly expensive process. And so looking at government funding agencies, philanthropic funding agencies, community funding agencies, as well as pharma, these are huge investments that have to be made. And so there's limitations in how much you can actually study. And only about 10% of compounds actually make it through this whole pipeline. And so the idea around repurposing is that if you can actually avoid some of the early stages, so for example, the phase 1 trials and that early stage of when a lot of medications will fail and can go right to the phase 2 trials after having some laboratory studies to suggest why you would study a drug in Parkinson's disease, then this actually increases potentially our ability to find a disease-modifying therapy quicker and cheaper. Okay, and in the last couple of minutes, I'm just going to talk about where we are in therapeutics for Parkinson's disease right now. And you saw a couple of resources to find clinical trials. I put up here a diagram that is from a paper published in the Journal of Parkinson's Disease. As you heard earlier, I'm the co-chief editor for this journal, and I just want to point out that it is freely accessible online to everybody. So it's an intended journal for, of course, researchers and clinicians in the field, but we're very committed to actually having patient awareness and involvement. And so all of these journals articles can be read by you. And one of the journal articles, so this one here, is actually one of the authors on it, Kevin McFarthing, is a person with Parkinson's disease and was involved in writing this article. And what he did here, together with other colleagues, was put together everything that's in what we call the clinical trials pipeline that's being tested as drugs. And so on the bottom, the ST is symptomatic therapies, the top is disease-modifying therapies, and then these are the different phases. And over the past, I think we're going to be in our 5th year now. So for the past 4 years, Kevin has been putting this together. And so every year we have a kind of updated version. And this is just a snapshot of what's actually happening in the clinical trial space, which I have to say is a lot. And I think that's a good thing. We have a relatively healthy clinical trials pipeline. And I just want to point out that I went in and circled all of the drugs that are in the disease-modifying therapy pipeline that are actually repurposed drugs. And so you can see here that there's a good representation of a large number of drugs that are being tested in the disease-modifying space that are repurposed and have the potential to maybe come to clinic sooner. In particular, exenatide is a medication that we all have our eye on, as well as this medication Ambroxol that, again, we're waiting to see what the outcome will be. Just in the last minute, I just wanted to point you in some directions of some resources as well, seeing what some of the initial questions were that came in regarding this webinar. I wanted to just give some of these resources to help answer some of them in case we don't get to in the last 10 minutes. So if you have questions about pharmacological symptomatic therapy, so the medications that you're on right now, or ones that you've read about or more curious about, I have to say that this resource put together by Parkinson's Canada together with the Finney Foundation, Every Victory Counts, is a remarkable resource that I know many of the people with Parkinson's who I see in my clinic find very valuable. If you're interested in non-pharmacological symptomatic therapies, this is a new resource that Parkinson's Canada has put out. I haven't used it yet, but I have to say that I'm very excited about seeing what it provides. But it's a care finder to help you find medical people, so neurologists, but more than that, to also find people like speech language pathologists and physiotherapists who are nearby and who have some expertise in Parkinson's disease. And in our journal in the upcoming year, we're going to have a whole issue about non-pharmacological interventions, which may be informative, I mean, definitely to researchers, but hopefully also to people with Parkinson's. You saw some resources for ongoing clinical trials. I point you in the direction of the HOPE list, which is a list actually put together and maintained by Kevin McFarthing, which is basically an Excel file. He, every couple of months, updates what's out there in terms of clinical trials. And he's obviously labeled it the HOPE list because it's to give us hope in terms of what's being out there and studied. And then on our website at the Journal of Parkinson's Disease is a huge resource list, actually, of clinicaltrials.gov, Michael J. Fox, other agencies that are trying to maintain lists of clinical trials, some of which obviously aren't going to be available to all of us, depending on where we live, but also give you a sense of what's out there. And then in terms of participating in clinical trials, of course, speaking to your local physicians is the first place. But as you heard earlier, there's this Canadian Open Parkinson Network, which tries to do a number of things. But one thing that it does, as well as a variety of others, is tries to maintain a registry of people across the country with Parkinson's. And the intention would be that when and if clinical trials, that you may be interested in or good candidates for, you will be contacted by the researchers to be able to be invited to be part of research studies or be informed about research studies, and then you can decide whether or not you want to be a part of them. And for those locally, I work at the Toronto Western Hospital in Toronto, and at our own clinic. And so if you're within the catchment area or could travel to Toronto and are interested in clinical trials, we have a specific email address, which I put right there. If you email that, send an email to that address, the other person on the other side is a research coordinator from our group, and she can go through with you what therapies are being tested, what other kinds of studies are being done, and see if there's anything that's of interest to you. So with that, thanks very much for your time, and I look forward to being together with Dr. Aquino to answer your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kalia, for providing an overview of disease-modifying therapies versus symptomatic therapies. In terms of the resources Dr. Kalia mentioned, we will be providing some of them again in the follow-up email, and we've actually written a blog post on the journal article that Dr. Kalia mentioned. I will also provide that link in the follow-up email. So without further ado, we can jump into the Q&A session. We've had a couple of pre-submitted questions, so I'm going to begin with that, and then I will look in our Q&A box and moderate those questions as well. So for our first question, this was directed towards Dr. Aquino. What is the consent process for clinical trials, and what does that entail?
Thank you for that very important question. So for participating in a clinical trial, as potential subject needs to be consented. That means go over all the potential benefits and risks related to the study, as well as having a very clear understanding of the process that will take part and all the tests and everything that entails being part of the clinical trial. So in most cases, you receive the consent form and you can take it home and you can read and go over it and contact the research coordinator and the investigator to clarify if you have any questions or concerns, and then the consent needs to be signed by the participant as well as the investigator. And that consent, before it's given to a subject, was approved by the ethics board of each institution to make sure that it complies with all the requirements, the ethics and regulatory requirements to be offered to participants.
Thank you, Dr. Aquino. This question was for Dr. Kalia. What are some challenges of getting a drug from preclinical to the clinical phase?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Natalie, and whoever submitted it prior to. Just from a definitions point of view, when we talk about preclinical, this is the laboratory space. So this is where we're testing drugs at what we call the wet bench, where we're trying to model the disease. So we are trying to simulate it either in cells in a dish or in different kinds of models to try and, as best as we can, imitate what is a complicated disease in humans. And so I'd say that's one challenge to begin with, is trying to do the best we can to try and imitate the biology and what goes wrong in the biology, so that what we're actually learning in the lab is of relevance to people with Parkinson's disease. And that's a major challenge. And lots of the I don't like to call them failures because we learn from everything, but lots of the reasons why we find amazing things in the laboratory and they don't necessarily translate into good treatments or new treatments for people with Parkinson's is because we have things that are just maybe a little bit too simplistic that we're trying to test in the lab, and maybe they can help one kind of aspect, but really when you put it in the context of a complicated disease in a human, they don't perform the same way. So that's one major challenge. Another major challenge is and these are just practical issues, right? I'm going to talk about practical things. I mean, another major challenge is just the work to be done in that is labor intensive and cost intensive, and when you're looking across the spectrum of diseases to treat and to research, there's a lot of different other competition out there. People want cancer figured out, people want heart disease figured out, and so there's of course only limited resource that can be done to look at diseases and understanding them, and then additionally, understanding safety again goes back to trying to emulate humans in the laboratories, that we don't always know what we're doing in the laboratory will eventually be translatable to humans, because what can be given in a safe way to humans would be different than what could be given to an experimental model in the lab. And so those are, I say, a couple of the hurdles.
Thank you, Dr. Kalia. These are all very important considerations. For Dr. Aquino, why are clinical trials the gold standard for drug approval?
Yes, so as I think we talked a little bit about this during the talk, as Dr. Kalia also mentioned, you can observe a potential benefit in a small group of patients or in one individual case, but that not necessarily means that when you apply that to a larger population with a very complex disease in the context of also having other health issues and other medications on board, that it will work in the same way. So that's why it's very important to have that homogeneous group compare with an active or a placebo to see, to confirm that potential benefit. And unfortunately, the only way of achieving that is by conducting a clinical trial.
Thank you. Dr. Kalia, in what time, I know you mentioned stem cell therapy briefly in your presentation. There was a question, in what time frame will stem cell therapy be open to the larger public?
Yeah, and maybe I'll take a step back with that question. So I guess in terms of time frame as to when it will be available to the general public, I think maybe the first question is if it will be available to the general public. Stem cell therapy is still very much an experimental therapy. There's a long history behind it, and people have been studying stem cell therapy. At least I'm talking about the stem cell transplant therapies. We could have probably a whole webinar about stem cells and what it means to each person, but I'm talking specifically about stem cells that get transplanted into areas of the brain that are affected in Parkinson's disease. And technologies are changing. So I think probably if you had this webinar 20 years ago, that would have been a question as well. And it looked like maybe stem cells were going to be on the horizon, but things became complicated and unanticipated consequences of the stem cell therapies made it so that it didn't end up coming to the general public. And now we have new technologies, which I think people are optimistic may overcome some of those challenges. But I'd still say we're so very much in the research realm. I mean, we're talking about phase 1, like safety trials right now, that I think I wouldn't commit to saying that that's going to be a standard of therapy yet. I think we're not going to know for a couple of years. And then if it is confirmed that it looks like it's going to be a therapy going forward, then we start talking about, and I think there were some questions around this about, regulatory and approvals and these kinds of things. So I think there's a long way to go for stem cells.
Thank you. So in the interest of time, I'm going to be fielding one more question for both Dr. Kalia and Dr. Aquino from the chat. So once a technology or drug is given FDA approval, how quickly will it be available to patients in Canada?
I can try to answer that one.
Yeah.
So not necessarily everything that's approved by one regulatory organ is going to be approved by another one. There are, for instance, right now, medications that are available for Parkinson's in the US and that have not been available in Canada. I'll give as an example a combination of extended release carbidopa, levodopa that's called Rytary. Another example is the inhaled levodopa, which is available in the US. So I think it requires an internal evaluation for that particular population. So when a drug applies for approval in a given country, they will look what is the number of patients that are going to benefit from that, what is the cost, do we have any other priorities at the moment in terms of other disease that we want medications approved for. And so some of the interventions will pass that threshold and will eventually be approved, and others will not. So it's very hard to commit with a time for that. There are in other cases, for instance, the drugs apply in Canada first and not in the US. I'll give an example. Dr. Kalia mentioned the phospholipid carbidopa, which is a subcutaneous version of levodopa carbidopa. As far as I'm aware, they have applied for commercialization in Canada, but not in the US yet. So we may have approval for that one before it's approved in other places.
Thank you, Dr. Aquino. And I would just like to close this webinar by saying thank you to everyone who submitted questions for today's speakers, and a very special thank you to Drs. Camila Aquino and Lorraine Kalia for joining us to discuss where we are at in the Canadian clinical trials pipeline. Today's webinar attendees will receive a follow-up email with a link to a recording of this webinar and any resources or links mentioned here today. We invite you to join us for the next webinar titled Ask Us Your Parkinson Questions Answered, which takes place on Wednesday, December 13th from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern, where members of our information referral team will be on hand to answer your questions about Parkinson's and care partnering. Watch your email inboxes for more details and registration links. On behalf of all of us at Parkinson Canada, I'd like to thank you for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. See you next month.